welcome to this morning's conversation about the impacts of COVID-19 on regional, rural and remote Australia. My name's Kate Charters and I'm the chair of SEGRA. SEGRA is the acronym for Sustainable Economic Growth for Regional Australia. And SEGRA is delighted to welcome you to this 13th of our conversations. I'd like to particularly welcome our two guests today, Michael Eales, Partner and Strategy Designer from Business Models Inc., and Leanne Kemp, the Queensland's Chief Entrepreneur. We're delighted to have you with us this morning and thank you both very much for your time. The webinar is fully subscribed and so we're not going to be able to actually go to people to ask questions, but we have a chat box at the bottom of the screen, and if you would like to enter a question or make a comment through that chat box, we'll do our best to ask those questions during our conversation. We'll also review those comments and incorporate them in the communique that we'll issue after the session. There's also a recording of this event and that will be made available on Monday via the SEGRA website, and you'll get that in our next email mail out as well. You'll notice that we've got a couple of email URL links at the top of the chat box, and they're to refer you to where our webinars are, and also we have a diagram that summarises the content that we've been covering. So as COVID-19 races across the world and Australia acts to address the unfolding situation, SEGRA wanted to provide an opportunity or a forum where people who live, work and invest in regional Australia could advance the issues impacting specifically on regional, rural and remote Australia. The idea of the webinar is to assist in bringing together key issues and opportunities whilst hearing firsthand from people tackling the impacts of COVID-19 in regional Australia. These impacts will be across health, the economy, education, well-being, lifestyle, health. And this week we'll be looking at the circular economy and how it can provide opportunities as a pathway out of the current COVID economic contractions. Robert's been collating a key issues diagram and has a visual of that information. So Robert, could I please hand over to you to just talk us through where our conversations have taken us so far? You're on mute, Robert. Robert, you're on mute.
Yep. Sorry about that, Kate. I got this. Hopefully, got the screen up there. Yes, when we started this, we all realised that no matter what, it was going to end. And the real issue is what is going to be the post-pandemic Australia, and for us, really, what might be the regional Australia that comes out the end of this. And in that journey, I suppose it's a problem-solving journey that we realised, well, through this time, it's really what is going to be the transition into post-regional Australia, post-pandemic regional Australia, and really taking the metaphor of the bridge, but saying, well, what will be our particular regional bridge of transition so we can come out of this stronger rather than weaker? So the conversations we've been having over the last about 5 to 6 weeks have been identifying a whole lot of issues and ideas, and we've sort of harvested those into this diagram that we keep expanding from left to right as we complete the various panel sessions. But it was fairly clear early on there's going to be ideas or actions around high impact hard infrastructure, high impact soft infrastructure. So, you know, people and place and infrastructure are going to be really important and triggers. Through the various conversations, we've been pulling out some of the key ideas out of them, and the most recent ones on the left-hand side came out of our last session around regional tourism. And just quickly over those, some of the key ideas were really to know your key economic indicators, protect regional aviation. I think that's going to be an interesting conversation for regional Australia, that will always be needed. The transformation of events and tourism based on social distancing, what is that going to mean moving forward? And definitely work into this building diverse sector linkages. So moving away from narrow products, narrow supply chains, looking at diverse place-based products. So early on there, you'll see in that patch, there were some of the speakers raised the issue of circular economy, and I'm very excited today we can delve into that much deeper with our panel. So back to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Robert. So now if I could turn to you, Michael, firstly, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, but can you then spend some time unpacking what the circular economy means and perhaps where you see it heading in terms of post-COVID-19? Thanks, Michael.
Great. I am going to apologise up front. I've got a remote clinical session going on with my child in the background, so if it's a bit too loud, just let me know and I can also just change the space I'm in. So thank you, Kate, and obviously to everybody for joining. I think this is an incredible time in history that we're facing, and my team and I, we have a global footprint, so we do have an interesting perspective across different markets and global framings around those that I'll share today. But Business Models Inc., we are a strategy, design, innovation agency based out of Amsterdam, but with offices here in Australia, and we have a particular focus on dealing with uncertainty and change, particularly as it relates to the decisions we make. So seeing Rob's decision tree there, or at least all the topics coming through, I think that's a fantastic lens. Is this getting too loud in the background? Just check in.
A little bit loud, yes.
Right, I might just shift where I am. Just bear with me 1 second. I'll continue though. So our focus in terms of the framing here for today's conversation, or what I wanted to bring to the table, is that there is great opportunity, and being optimistic about this, but also quite a pragmatist. I do want to highlight that the role of design thinking or design doing is something that I'm sure Leanne will talk about at some point. Getting GSD, I'll hand that to Leanne later, is critical. And from my background and my perspective, the work we've been doing within the circular economy, both here in Australia and overseas, has shown me that the mindset and the willingness to dive into, get your hands dirty on looking at some of the framings that Rob just presented around supply chains, understanding not only the context and the trends that are shaping our regional economy as much as the people that live and work within it is critical, and we'll dive into that. But perhaps just to address your key point there at the start on what my perspective on the circular economy is. A framing that we often talk about at Business Models Inc. is the shift from the linear to the circular economy. And what do we mean by that? It's actually talking about this loop that, in a linear sense, it was the take, make, and dispose framing. So if you think of the way we extract resources from the economy, actually create value from those resources, and then ultimately consume and dispose of them. That is a single line that's linear toward waste. And one thing that we see within the circular economy is this framing around the sort of unlimited reuse of materials and goods. And what we see happening in the post-COVID recovery space is the acceleration, actually the speeding up of many closing of the loop type scenarios, and we'll explore that throughout this conversation, I'm sure. But closing the loop and actually dealing with the mindset, the framing around people's responses to the conscious approach now to not only the relationships with others, but also our awareness of the environment around us. And not just talking about the natural environment, I'm talking about the context of the world shaping us as we have all been living through this crisis. We'll come out with a set of changes that will make us more conscious of our relationships, both to one another, but also across the much broader system. And we're certainly seeing that in regional economies in particular. When you do talk about the tourism sector, there was a great webinar that you hosted previously on this topic, but looking at the connectedness of the local people and businesses to not only themselves, but now to the global framing is incredibly important. So when we do talk about the circular economy and the patterns for how we can address growth, but not for growth's sake, but growth in a post-COVID world, we're definitely looking at local over global, looking at the use of our resources together, actually. So extending the use, but also strengthening the value chains and supply chains that connect us, and really looking at where else we can deepen the connection within not only the economy and the jobs, but also the social fabric, the relationship again between all of us at this moment in time is critical to understand, and for all of us in business to actually appreciate what that shift means for our businesses. So I might just pause there.
Thanks, Michael. And Leanne, if we could invite you into the conversation. Welcome, Leanne. Leanne's Queensland's Chief Entrepreneur. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've seen the circular economy evolving in the last little bit, and some of the lessons that we might learn to take forward?
Well, I think circular economy was, a distant thought that was crystallised probably half a decade ago now. And what I am seeing is government's commitments to understanding the importance of environment and climate, and the circular economy itself underpins an economic transition. The commitments around sustainability, climate, environment, arguably one could say that it's taken a backdrop to the importance of the pandemic and the health crisis that we're facing now. But as many governments and businesses and even entrepreneurs try and grapple with what does the new future look like, how do we best use the access to localized resources, whether that be talent and or natural capital, how do we bring that forward into the forefront? China already has a federal minister for circular economy appointed, and has been appointed in that federal role now for the better part of the number of years. We have constructed working groups and policy groups dedicated to circular economy in the OECD in Europe. And so from a global perspective, this is no longer just a thought patterning. This is commitment to policy, procedure, and ministerial roles. Arguably, what is the impact to rural regional Queensland? And I think we'll kind of echo forward from where Michael was leading out. Most definitely, I've been working with Everledger, my own company, now for 5 years. We have 100 people in the world. We operate in 6 countries, and we do the traceability and the transparency of some of the most opaque supply chains. And I would say pre-COVID, you would never see a speech that would have been embedded with the words of supply chain or advanced manufacturing from a prime minister or a president. And yet every channel that I turn to now, whether it be Trump in the US or whether it be even our own prime minister today, these conversations around manufacturing, reshoring, and resource recovery is now on the forefront and the top of the tongue of many of our thought leaders globally. So it's not just a matter of if now, it's a matter of when. The when and if are converging together. What does this mean for rural regional Queensland? We've probably already seen what it means. We're starting to see existing manufacturers pivot to be able to provide for new forms of supply chains. And it's our opportune time to be able to think about, if we can't gain access to some of the commodities that are available in overseas markets, then what can we get our hands on here locally to be able to make and or remanufacture or remake goods that are important in the current context of time? And the example of that is PPE, medical equipment. These are critical, important supply chains that before COVID were not necessarily thought about. But right now, there's a lot of grappling and conversations about saying, just how do we get the scaled up infrastructure in place to help the broader population and our citizens in the world? And we're not necessarily thinking that we have to buy it from China. We just need it now. So Queensland is perfectly positioned to address that last mile challenge, and we're doing so. We're seeing pivots in manufacturing that were once rum distilleries making hand sanitizers. We're seeing companies that were making sails for yachts pivoting into PPE and clothing and equipment. Plastics intrusion manufacturers are also looking at how can they actually gain access to plastic waste out of our COEX scheme to be able to make dispensers, hand sanitizing dispensers that are Bluetooth enabled. So how can we bring that together in a way that COVID becomes the catalyst, that enzyme for change? But when we tool up with this capability, it won't be about us just making hand sanitizers. It'll be about us localizing supply chains and jobs back here in Australia than ever before.
Thanks very much, Leanne. We're certainly hearing much about this localised response and bringing things back on shore. If you've got a comment, though, I'm interested in the gap between the innovators and the first responders and the next group of people. Have you got ideas about how we can support and encourage innovators in regional Australia?
So we need solutions, not ideas at this point in time. There are problems to be solved and there are challenges that are needing to be met. So that's not to take away from the importance of ideas and early stage reimagination of business models, but we have a criticality of time that's being afforded to us now. So more solutions, less ideas. That's not to say that we can't prototype on 3D printing, etc., but we need to be thinking about our ability to scale out from an idea into a solution far more quicker than ever before. There's clinical trials underway in various forms, and we know and understand that when we talk about the vaccine per se, that must go through a linear approach. But how do you bring exponential product development into the forefront of thinking now? Take that really early stage idea, connect that through in an entire community, because it's unlikely that the complexity of the componentry that we need to solve these challenges can be sufficiently solved by one inventor or one supplier. So we need to move Queensland to a point of taking us from not just only supporting ideas, but to a platform of innovation. And that takes the relationship of those strange bedfellows. Who would have thought that in an overseas market like the luxury supplier of Louis Vuitton would pivot from their perfume manufacturing into hand sanitizers? And the same thing needs to occur here in Queensland. When we think about those waste streams, how do you get clean waste streams coming into manufacturing so that that reliable supply can then pony up with companies like BMI to reimagine a future and then connect that across Queensland? I would say it's the role of Queensland's Chief Entrepreneur's Office, right, to help with that connectivity and to bridge that gap that Robert so eloquently put on the front page of his presentation, and to pressure into government a way upon which that they can spin up a rapid response network, and to make that available and front end. This is the demand. At the moment, innovators should be led by the KPI of demand. Where's the demand for innovation right now? Is it in PPE? Is it in equipment? Is it in solving for our social distancing? Is it in the enlivenment of our vaccine? So governments need to be very clear and articulated about here's the problem to be solved, then network up under an open innovation framework with enough collaboration to be able to get all of those people together to be demand-led, challenge-led, and solution-led.
Thanks very much, Leanne. And we've certainly heard a bit about business-to-business collaboration at the moment, but possibly a little too much focus on disaster recovery rather than new ideas, leveraging new ideas into solutions. Michael, if I can just turn to you, what's your feeling about the capacity of regional Australia to bring innovation together?
I think when we talk about innovation, there's a spectrum here that we always frame, and that's that improvement end versus true invention. And I think it's absolutely critical to appreciate the resourcefulness and as such that we would typically frame of a strong regional Australia. And I think that's something that I would always start with when framing how a community, scaled up as a nation, but how we can all work together to actually solve for these problems. And I think just doubling down on that point, it is the time for doing in respect to coming together and being agile with speed to really assess what are those problems that are hitting us in the face, where we have the resourcefulness and the capacity as a nation, and as regional Australia in particular here to tackle these issues. And while we had a whole series of challenges framed there beautifully by Leanne, one thing I would zoom in on is then from a responsiveness point of view, looking at each of us as individuals, looking at how we maintain a level of equality across the not only access to resources but the opportunities that are presented here. And when we talk about that equality, I don't mean so much by way of sort of a level setting so that it's a sort of a gamed economy. I'm meaning more that we have access to those opportunities that are being presented, and are able to adapt to what is ultimately a series of unknowns, and the uncertainty facing us in a post-recovery sense is going to be the new normal. And when we do talk about innovation, that new normal, it's absolutely doing more with less. It's critical that we maintain an agility or a willingness to look at what we do, what effort we contribute to our communities, and consider how we might reframe those in times of right now crisis, but also be very conscious as we move forward as to what that new normal looks like and how we show up, because jobs, of course, is going to be a mission critical factor in terms of just the backbone economic health for all regional Australia, and the leadership that we all need to show in that new normal is going to determine whether we actually thrive in a post-COVID world as regional Australia. Perhaps just to be more specific on the query or the question there about how to innovate or how to build the capacity or capability, the way the government has shown up, and this is all levels of government, I would talk to you now, really signals that it is, as a nation, we're benefiting from effectively the biggest shareholder in many businesses right now, theoretically here, with the tax support that we're getting, and we're almost being able to, in some respects, look at the limited resources from a capital point of view versus the potential unlimited resourcefulness of the people, but also the natural environment here in Australia, and say, like, how do we marry these two opportunities and benefits? And pulling out the problems and prototyping solutions, we're seeing just incredible speed at which some of our manufacturing sectors responded to the challenges, as Leanne's just talked to. And there was no blueprint for that. There was literally phones ringing hot 24 hours a day to try and figure out how to get the resources, how to get the tooling, how to get the staff to pivot. Ultimately from, in the case of a manufacturer who might have been, I think, Leanne, the example there was the sales for boats, towards now PPE. I think they're just responses to what is immediately in front of us, and that's where we would always frame the improvement domain, and through lots of iterative approaches to improving our problem or the solutions to the problems that we're facing, we will have those breakthrough sort of innovative invention type, novel, new, and perhaps from an ideas point of view, typically tagged as that innovative idea breakthrough, but that doesn't come with the tin hat and a light bulb. It actually comes through effort and doing and discovery. So, what better part of the economy than regional Australia to be able to respond to what are very difficult times, and again, the resilience of the community, the local over the global focus, shortening the supply chains, supporting each other and our businesses is going to be absolutely critical to building that capability and the capacity to innovate.
I was wondering, to follow on from Leanne's challenge about solutions first, this is a question to both of you in a context like pre-COVID, innovation is risky on the fringes. Post-COVID, the government is going to invest a lot of money in projects. A government structure that its view of innovation is show me where it's been done before, and we'll sit here and do it after it's done. So COVID's taken that time away. You're saying we've got to innovate fast now and agile. The government's going to invest millions, if not billions, in trying to help build this bridge of transition. we're in a space there that, even though you're throwing that out, what are your thoughts about the practical solutions of a risk-averse structure having the front line of capital investment and the triggers that are supposed to represent this innovative culture that's always been on the fringe of fearful government? Thoughts on that?
Look, I'm going to kind of put it out there as I do. I'm an honorary appoint by the Queensland government as the chief entrepreneur, so I'm not paid for my comments, and sometimes my comments they would never pay me for in any event. But our structure of government doesn't weave innovation horizontally. It silos it in a department, in a box, and considers it on its fringe. And to a certain extent, it looks towards universities and mad scientists and crazy entrepreneurs as the personalities or the personas of innovation, which is very wrong. We also have a policy enlivenment that is driven in time boxing of election cycles, and those priorities sit within those election cycles. It's time to start thinking about a 100-year living policy. It's time to start considering that innovation should be embedded and cascaded horizontally, well within a cross-threading of government and into all of these infrastructure builds. It's also very clear that just as much money that we put into physical infrastructure, we should be doubling that into digital infrastructure. If we had a 100-year living policy in 1989 with the internet and HTTP was born and Tim Berners-Lee, and that became a prioritised order of our policy moving forward, one would say we wouldn't have the last mile connected issues or the NBN challenges that we have today, because it would have been made a lighthouse crystallising priority for our nation. And we need to call that out now. We need to start thinking about a 2.0 strategy for advancing Queensland priorities. And that is, unfortunately, the burden of our government. Will they do that now at the time horizon of election? Well, they should be. Now, if we can't wholly influence a change in government, so be it. But in clustered communities, we have 3 tiers of government in this country. So if not Queensland, then local. If not local, then federal. And if not any of those, then certainly clustered industry bodies. In the southeast corner here, we have 22 industry-led peak bodies, of which we're involved, to help in recovery. We've gone well beyond response. We've been working in recovery now for the better part of the last 6 to 8 weeks at an industry peak body end. If not government, then peak bodies can make these recovery changes and these prioritisation placements. So it can now come. We're moving from a type of leadership that's hierarchical in its order into innovation logic and systems leadership. The way you can bring that systems leadership forward. It's a different way of working. Kind of similar to when we talk about corporations only looking at shareholder value. The world has understood that capitalism in its form needs to reform. And how do you think about shareholder value to stakeholder value, the wider stakeholders that are at play now? And no truer time than that is when we think about COVID. The COVID response is coming out not just in terms of that larger shareholder view that you mentioned, Michael, in terms of that being the shareholder of most businesses now because of our government support, but it's social enterprises that have remedied up. It's been the clustering in a social contract that we've given to the community at large. This has really been the powerful force of change, and that will be the powerful force of recovery, not just looking for government to the answers now. They've given us a response, they're there, but now it's whole of peak bodies, it's whole of industry, it's whole of communities, and that systems leadership piece can move it.
Michael, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it was a great question and great topic. Well positioned there, Leanne. I think looking at it through the role of government, it is a double-edged sword in so many ways, looking at the tensions and the trade-offs with our system. But certainly from a mandate, we have an expectation. And what I've seen in the work with government, we're actually working at the moment with one of the departments, Digit here in Queensland, on a risk and resilience tooling platform for small business, and primarily attached to the tourism sector, but it's got a bigger role to play around that recovery space. And I want to say that the government is very open to solutions that are put in front of them with a well thought through approach is probably one frame. Looking to the government to ask us to show up and to answer their questions is certainly something that does happen, of course, but right now the responsiveness in that recovery sense is to finding the pockets of resilience and areas where solutions can be accelerated in the market. And we're seeing a good level of response across all levels of government, actually, in regards to being proactive there. So I encourage everybody to step forward with their local member, with their local public officers, to actually address any of those solutions frames with confidence that there's certainly an ear that's more attentive, in fact, than probably recent living memory. And just maybe walking through that a little bit more, I think there's a bit of a history lesson here, which I won't attempt to explore, but the role and the mandate of government in our society is certainly one that we need to take advantage of in these times. And when we do talk about the relationship between the civic sector, which includes the civil leadership that we all have a responsibility to step up and take ownership of, so that's the individuals within our society, but also the institutions that wrap around us. It's critical that we get a balance there, and I've been absolutely energized by the level of leadership now being demonstrated by sort of non-government actors or agencies, including industry bodies and businesses and just community members. So in that regard, certainly step forward as community leaders in your own backyard, but also join together and work across a much broader regional framing in order to ensure that when we get out of this post-COVID, post-recovery space, we're going to be much more aligned and coordinated. And government will definitely help there. I've written that down. The role of your office, Leanne, is to connect. I think that's a brilliant frame, and I think all governments should have that mindset, because that's the enablement function of bringing people together and presenting accessibility to the people and the resources to get things done. And probably just last statement then, in terms of the role of government, I would also point towards the responsiveness we saw in the fires prior to this crisis. The ability to manage in an unknown space is something that these are lessons we must embed. And I'm confident that the current leadership I've seen from government is that these lessons are being observed, real time, captured, and we are going to learn a lot more if this cycle happens again. We will be better at responding to it. But there's a bigger picture here around how we pivot the parts of the system that are quite fragile, that are now completely exposed. And I think, again, going back to that circular economy, the role of government here to step up and to be bold in framing some of the shifts that have to happen so that we don't get so exposed to these fragile parts of the system that ultimately are just sort of holding on almost like threads to each other. And we've really got to strengthen those bonds so we're not as exposed if this happens again.
Yeah, it's interesting, this concept of if it happens again. And I suppose, Leanne, it's interesting hearing you say that you're already solution focused rather than problem focused. And I certainly think that that's something we can all take away from today's conversation, the importance of communication, and that's come up at other times, but in other webinars. But I suppose this communication is quite targeted, not just information, but actually trying to generate some activity or initiative. We've just got a question that's come through here that's exactly on this, that government and community are currently committed to localised supply chains in the crisis. Will that commitment stay on going forward? And I suppose it's not will that, but how do we keep that commitment going forward?
I think it's a challenge. I mean, the reality is that we as a consumer-led society, consumerism at the forefront, is interested in supply chains that deliver quicker, faster, cheaper, fast fashion being one of those sort of qualities which have led us into this environmental hazarding conversation well before COVID. I think we need to move to a new values-based system, and that will take into account that, in particular in a manufacturing sense, maybe we cannot compete ever on a cost base, because we have a quality of life here, and we certainly have a cost base of living. We need to start to understand, how can we reduce our cost of energy consumption here in Australia? We have ridiculously large costs of energy, and unless we can pressure in to have that energy cost reduced, or somehow move to a distributed grid or microgrid system, then our cost base of manufacturing will still remain high when comparing it to the likes of ASEAN countries or Asia itself. But maybe we compete on a longer tail understanding of the externality of cost that is embedded within cheap, faster, less rigid supply chains. So can we think more deeply around durability as being a value construct of our manufacturing? And if we lead out in durability, and we do take a consciousness out into the consumer market, where people are saying, I don't even want to know where it just comes from, but I want to know, where does it go after it leaves me? So that's the circular economy, construct, provenance built within it. But I'm also caring about, not that it's going to last 1, 2, or 3 times. I need to know that it's going to last in my first life, as well as its second and third iteration of its product. So durability needs to be built into this conversation as a value construct. And it's going to need the enlivenment of government and policy to bring that together in such a way. The big challenge for Queensland is, we are resource rich. And even through this time, I would say maybe mining is going to miss out on the paradigm of recovery, because they're still digging holes and shipping a lot of our dirt still out on ships across the world. So we're commodity enriched as a country, but we don't necessarily look at value adding on top of that commodity. And that's the piece of recovery here that is interesting, which is where we can enliven a whole new sense of reasoning around manufacturing. But it's a tough paradigm to move, because we're still heavily embedded in commodity-based GDP. And we do well as a country. That's our prosperity backbone, albeit the externality is the cost to our environment. So there is a really tricky piece of maneuvering here that needs to be felt. COVID has not really impacted the mining sector. It's impacted tourism, our people, our experiential sort of cognitive involvement in the state, but it hasn't affected any of the profits of mining really hard. It's going to take a brave set of leaders to really tip the toys out of the toy box.
Michael.
Yeah, I think that I'll double down on that, and also the comment just made in the chat there around government's role here, where we have different speeds in the economy, and that's always been the nature of the strength of our extractive resources sector. I think just pitting it back to also the costs of living, or just costs more generally in terms of our competitive positioning in the global context. We're going to see an enormous effort being made by not just countries and nations as a whole, but within countries, economic zones and regions, competing at a level and with the muscle and a focus that we've probably never seen in living memory. Post this recovery phase, once we get the confidence to sort of start pulling on some levers, to not to say to get back to normal, because I think that's the wrong framing, but certainly to assist in the leveling of what is a very interdependent global economy. So there will be big winners as a result of others not being able to respond. And when I say others, that's both industry and government. And within each of our communities, I think we need to be super conscious of what local means. And this framing around reshoring manufacturing is I think in terms of the jury's out on the commitment now. It's absolutely a commitment by the government and industry to strengthen that part of the economy. And I think one thing I'd reflect on there in terms of manufacturing is the role of design in creating value-added products and services. I think as a nation, we're actually really well credentialed with capable people in the design space to help us look at these value-added frames. And I'll put a link on the chat, but we set up a task force with an organisation called Good Design Australia, a COVID design response task force with a whole gathering of the best designers in this nation, who are volunteering themselves to respond to problems with a solutions frame. And so that's an open conversation to anyone on this call. You can actually put in a request for help, and that task force will respond. And that's, again, looking at that civic leadership, looking at a pocket within society that can work with government and communities and individuals in this regard to solve these problems that are hitting us in the face. But it's also to embed a level of momentum into a shift from extracting stuff, which is, again, a backbone of our economy, to value adding and ensuring that we don't come out of this crisis actually further behind others in the world that are going to be, again, putting a lot of effort, a lot of resources into capturing what is a big gap between where we were and where we are today. And that economic gap is going to be sought after by many nations at speed. So we have to be ready.
I was wondering if I could follow up on your comments about local becoming more important. And in a practical way, has you, Michael or Leanne, any thoughts on what this might mean from a circular economy point of view for Main Street business, local business, chambers of commerce, the new future, the new normal? Local's important. Does circular economy mean different systems, networks? Does the nature of local business need to change? Thoughts on that at that scale?
I'll just jump in first, Leanne, if you're happy. My only comment there is a high level, because I think Leanne's going to have a deeper lived experience here with her role and perspective. But I'll just say that in that local over global frame, so supporting each other, we're seeing some great initiatives from chambers of commerce and other businesses within our communities to ensure that we're keeping the monies and the resources in the communities that we live and work. Critical thing here is going to be what that impact of ultimate global trade and it's in particular in the tourism sector. How do we adapt with potentially a shift in that demand side? And we do need to embrace technology. We absolutely have to embrace at a level and a speed which we've probably been lucky to not have had this forced on us pre-crisis to any great extent, but the need to keep up, or catch up, I should say, with other parts of the world that have adopted a level of technology leadership in industries, including tourism, is now very at the forefront, very much in the scope of everybody that's in the sector to adapt to. I'll pass it back to Leanne.
I think there's a lack of commitment to continuity for rural regional Queensland. We treat it as a separate sector. What if Queensland combined that together and actually made that as a whole of government paradigm and thinking? And so by virtue of the fact that you are placing it out in a spectrum of its own, places it out into, the same type of lack of inclusion that exists in, gender bias as a prime example. So there has to be this continuity of commitment to say, this is as important as any economic discussion. We need to lead out in this whole of state approach and make it accountable. At the moment, it feels like it's seasonal, or it's separated from its core and it's atomized in its universe. And by virtue of that, it becomes, one of the planetarial movements across governmental policy or even in economic considerations. There's a lot of opportunity for us in rural regional Queensland because we have a skills base that we can leverage out from. And we're not necessarily embracing that well. We're still seeing it as an externality of its core. So how do we do that? I mean, why don't we have a very, very clear set of mandates across all of our purchasing and our procurement policies in government, but also even our largest corporations in Queensland? Virgin, maybe that's the wrong example today because they're in voluntary administration, but if they're here operating and want to continue to operate, then show us show us your profit, loss, and regional impact statement. Show us that and publish it, and maybe that will turn the dial a little bit more. But at the moment, we're seeing it as a separated atom, and by virtue of that, it's like an adult versus child relationship, which should not actually be the case.
Thank you very much, Leanne. We, as always, have run out of time. It's been a great conversation, and I'd like to thank you and Michael particularly for participating. Just to give Michael and Leanne a chance to a 2-minute of opportunity for things to wrap up, or things you wanted to say and haven't had a chance. Michael.
Maybe just with respect to the topic here and the circular economy, I think be very much focused on the shift that we're seeing. I do want to maybe just close with a link back to where Leanne left off there around measuring consequences actually, and the impact of the consequences of what are ultimately a range of decisions that we need to be rethinking and looking at in order to absolutely reset our not just economy more broadly, but reset our society so that we can compete moving forward. And I would absolutely love, no doubt Leanne's already doing this, but that the voice, Leanne, that you have here in addressing this sort of impact framing and consequence framing for business, I think would be a great start to put a stronger floor under the regional economy.
Leanne, closing
remarks? Today's an interesting day because it's the day that it happens to have published in the Courier Mail. Not that I subscribe to the Courier Mail myself, but I wrote a thought leadership piece about the third dimension of recovery is on the horizon. And, despite what experts are telling us about recovery being V-shaped or W-shaped or L-shaped, it's not. There's a third dimension here, and it's a Z-axis. And as we start to see over time the adoption of these digital transformation tooling, we're starting to see systems that would normally take 2 years in development compress into 2 months. And this came out from the CEO of Microsoft. The amount of technical resourcing that's going into feature-enriched digital infrastructure is significant. So the third dimension, that Z-axis on recovery, is really important to embed within our thinking, because we will not return to the same X and Y paradigm. Like time and business will return back to normal. So start thinking about that third dimension. And the third dimension needs to be embedded within government, because as they will continuously pour into hard infrastructure, we need to be putting it into the parallel Z-axis of that digital infrastructure. And that will help us compete then as a nation on not just only exporting commodities, and I've been talking about this for a while. We have great natural resources. We have incredible natural beauties like the Great Barrier Reef, but we also have amazing natural talent, and we can compete on a world scale now with our natural talent. And that's also a part of the transition that we should all start to embrace here now.
Thanks, Leanne. We just have a closing comment that to Leanne. Love the idea of citizen and industry-led requests for regional support for Queenslanders. So thanks for you both very much for participating in this teleconference. I've got pages of scribbled notes. I found what you had to say very, very interesting. As I said, we'll circulate a communique that captures the ideas of today's conversation and remarks in the chat box. We've got quite a few chat box links, video links, so we'll get them out to you in the communique. You can also visit the SEGRA website, and under the general button, we've put together some useful websites for people to access. If you'd like to contact me directly, my email is kate@segra.com.au or robert@vitalplaces.com.au. On Wednesday next week, we'll be hearing from investment attraction gurus Steve Torso and from Climate Kick Australia, Genevieve Mortimer. And I'd just like to pull together one of the threads that's come out for me in this presentation is, or in this conversation, is the importance of values. And one of the projects Robert and I've been working on over the last 4 years is how do you develop an investable business case? And we have found in our work that the starting point is deeply understanding the values of your community. And so that was a nice comment from my and matched my experience. Look, once again, thank you very much, Leanne and Michael, and we look forward to talking to people again on Wednesday at 11 o'clock. Thank you.